is about, I've written now, when I did The Wilderness Warrior on Theodore Roosevelt, it was the first great progressive era, 1901 to 1909. And in that progressive era, Theodore Roosevelt saved nearly 234 million acres of wild America. He did it through many mechanisms, but really a concern of the public lands. He had gone to Harvard and done his first book, a booklet called The Summer Birds of the Adirondacks. He had famously spent his time in the Badlands of North Dakota and wrote beautiful essays, Theodore Roosevelt, about the Little Missouri River or about the Bighorn Mountains. And he was one of our great naturalists beyond being an incredible president. But what he did as president was create U.S. Forest Service up today with Gifford Pinchot, and the idea that you can look at a map of America, particularly west of the Mississippi, and see so many unbelievable amount of national forest lands, and you have Theodore Roosevelt to thank for that. He also used executive power for national monuments. He went to the Grand Canyon, saw that they were going to mine it for zinc, asbestos, and copper, and said, "Do not touch it. God has made it. You will only mar it. Leave the Grand Canyon alone." And in that oration, there, the Senate was going to go forward with it, and Roosevelt used the executive power of the Antiquities Act. The Antiquities Act in 1906 is an elastic piece of legislation that allows presidents, in the name of science, to save treasure landscapes. And so in the with the Grand Canyon case, most of the Antiquities Act was meant for about 16 acres, maybe 60 acres. Today, if it wasn't for Theodore Roosevelt, we wouldn't have the Grand Canyon over 1 million acres. And what I loved when I wrote about Theodore Roosevelt, spent time in Oyster Bay, is the way he would talk about the natural heirlooms of America. He would say things like, that the British have Westminster Abbey, we have the Tetons. India has Taj Mahal, we have our redwood forest. Comments like that gave everybody a sense that this was what American heritage was really all about, about saving these extraordinary places. I credit him with creating U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. He created the first 51 federal bird reservations. And the first one in now all of you own 550 national wildlife refuges. And the first was Pelican Island, Florida. If you ever get a chance to go down there, Tweed has, it's worth going to. There's a plank for all of our national wildlife refuges, and it's the most undersung story in conservation. Is just how many of these wildlife refuges, TR, led us to save. The one in Pelican Island, Florida, where the boardwalk is. 100 years ago, anybody coming to an Oyster Bay town hall, any of the women here, would have come with a bonnet with ornamental feathers. And you may not think you would have, but you would have for a public event. And maybe a dead hummingbird. But they were, nothing screams federal protection like birds that have migratory routes, because you can have a very progressive New York State, bird laws, bird protection laws. If the birds fly to Florida and get massacred at their rookeries, then you can't have it. And so it can't be done state by state. And Roosevelt famously said, "What's going to stop me from declaring Pelican Island a federal bird reservation?" Lawyers mumbled, and he said, "I so declare it. We're going to," and this was radical, because Florida at the time, this is not that long when his presidency after the Civil War. You all see states' rights sentiments never died down in our country now, and Florida, Confederate state, was angry. A New Yorker is telling us we could get arrested for shooting a heron or an egret. And the feather mafias down there would gun them all down to pluck those ornamental feathers, and they would steal the eggs. And so if you didn't come in strong with federal authority, you were going to have extinction of very charismatic species. And Roosevelt constantly would say things like, to lose one bird species is like to slash all the Rembrandts, or lines like that. And so he started in some of those first national wildlife refuges. For example, Yukon Delta in Alaska is the size of West Virginia. I mean, but what's radical about it was that it was given over to species. You couldn't go there to hunt, you would go there to observe the rookeries. You would be able to go there if you were a biologist, but you couldn't go there to, it wasn't they weren't designed necessarily for outdoor recreation. They were designed for species and their protection. So I wrote this book, The Wilderness Warrior, about Theodore Roosevelt's era, and that was the first wave of environmentalism. Then I wrote the second wave, and it's another Roosevelt, FDR, from 1933 to 1945. FDR he really was the progenitor of 800 state parks. His civilian conservation corps, unemployed men making $1 a day. His CCC workers, they ended up planting close to 3 billion trees. We think of the Depression as being the stock market collapse, the financial crisis, but we were dealing with a deep agricultural crisis. We had clear-cut forest. We had drained the wetlands. We weren't doing proper scientific forestry or crop rotation. We had the Dust Bowl going on in the Great Plains. It was an abomination. And FDR and the New Deal came in and not only saved iconic national parks in the TR spirit. I mean, he'd saved places like the Everglades and the Smokies and Channel Islands in California, Olympic Peninsula. I mean, many, Isle Royal in Michigan, Mammoth Cave, FDR. But with Harold Ickes, it really was a very a second wave of federal government prioritizing the environment. And to realize what I mean by prioritizing, Theodore Roosevelt said the protection of our natural resource and the management of it is the number one job of a president. Now, he would have probably equally have said keeping our strong military, robust Navy, but this was not something that was second tier for either Roosevelt. Wherever FDR went in life, under occupation, he put tree farm. Winston Churchill received his Christmas trees from the Roosevelt farm every year. And you talk about conflict of interest, FDR, as president, would take out regular ads every holiday season in the New York Times saying Roosevelt trees for sale. I have a New Deal Christmas. And you would buy the trees from the Roosevelt farm along the Hudson River in Hyde Park. So I did those, and what I'm here to just tell you about is the last book, the end of this sort of trilogy, and there's no Roosevelt. I wish I could have told you that it would have been easy just to do Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon presidents, but unlike the Roosevelts, neither of those presidents quite had that conservation gene. They cared, but they didn't care like the Roosevelts did. But it was a third wave, and I call it the long 60s, about 1960 to 1973. It's known for civil rights in Vietnam and women's movement and the assassination of the Kennedys and King in the tumultuous 60s and all of that. But it was also the great third wave of conservation when it turned to the word environmental. And all of you here, if I wanting to come to a town hall tonight, are part of this Silent Spring Revolution. You're carrying on what they accomplished in that particular era. I wish I could tell you I wish I began the book in 1960. It wouldn't have been as fat. But in truth, the reason I was doing 60 is because for John F. Kennedy and the Democratic Party, trying to score points against Eisenhower, who he was a great outdoors person, but he wasn't into the environment and conservation much. He did save the ANWR you hear about, the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge on his way out, and he also demilitarized Antarctica. But he's not one of the top presidents, conservation very low. So Kennedy and the Democrats in 60 decided to grab onto it, and they're talking about air quality, ways to fight smog, the stop of the vulgarization of highways, new wilderness areas, national parks, etc. And it's there in the platform that John F. Kennedy adopted in Los Angeles in 1960 Democratic Convention. I could have also used 1960 as a starting point. It would have been convenient. The great photographer Ansel Adams, who does those great black and white images, he wrote his famous book with Nancy Newall called This Is the American Earth, and it would show beautiful pictures of, coastal redwoods, or, a beautiful Sierra Mountain photography next to dumping zones of Oakland or San Jose or stockyards. It was a call published by the Sierra Club to start doing more, having a third wave, as I'm calling it, of conservation. Wallace Stegner, this famous novelist who won Pulitzer Prize, wrote this genius book about wilderness, and I really recommend it. It's called The Wilderness Letter by Stegner. Any of you have heard of Wallace Stegner? Good. Read The Wilderness Letter by him if you get a chance online. Really well done. What was going on by 60 on wilderness was the wilderness lobby was saying, look, we're building highways everywhere, but we need to have 1 million or 2 million acre parcels of land saved for the refurbishment of wildlife and as a solitude sanctuary and mass acreage with no roads. The big enemy became roads on the wilderness movement, because the Wilderness Society, born in 1935, with Aldo Leopold and Robert Marshall and others, they came to the conclusion that if we didn't do that, everything would get ruined. We wouldn't really be, you can't if you bring a road into an area, you're gonna then get electricity, sewage, rest centers, and it's gonna get commercialized, developed. So we need to have some real estate that is just deeded over to the natural world. And that was a hot topic in 1960. The point is, guys, I could have begun my book in 60. There was a lot of rationale. But in truth, it all began the third wave in 1945. And it began in 1945 because of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The dropping of the atomic bombs was game-changing. It's only one time in world history that one country has a nuclear monopoly, the United States, from 1945 to 1949. We were so excited. We had the bomb. It was represented the Manhattan Project, but American science, military, power. It won the war. It was everything, the atomic bomb. So most people cheered, but there was a small group of dissenters, or at least skeptics of atomic bombs and the dropping them on civilian populations. And one of those was William O. Douglas. Douglas had been was appointed to the Supreme Court in 1937 by FDR. He was from Yakima, Washington. He was a wilderness fanatic. He was climbing like Mount Rainier at the time in Washington at the time of Hiroshima. He couldn't understand why, if they were going to do it, it wasn't blown up on an island or something, not in a civilian population center. But more concerned, he almost was the president. If you cut to the 1944 convention of FDR's unprecedented fourth term for president that nobody thought he'd do, he wanted William O. Douglas to be his VP. It became the money people in the Democratic Party, the industrialists in particular, wanted Truman. And Douglas was what he was then and became a radical environmentalist. Almost had him as president, and Douglas said, I would never have dropped the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So it's a strong voice in the Supreme Court. But also the woman that's in the title of my book, Rachel Carson, was objecting to not just the nuclear bombs at Hiroshima and Nagasaki as much as the continuing testing of nuclear weapons. From 1945 to 1992, the United States detonated 1,054 nuclear weapons. And in the early days after World War II, we were using the Bikini Island, Bikini Atoll. I'm sure all of you know that's where the term bikini comes from, because it was so hot. You lost part of your clothing because they were blowing up the Bikini Atolls, but there were indigenous people living there that got sick and poisoned and contaminated. And then they would use the Nevada test range. And in Nevada, even Nevadans love the atomic bombs. It's like they like seeing the buildings shake in Las Vegas. It seemed to be a bit of pride, America's atomic power, and here at our own state. But Rachel Carson was working for U.S. Fish and Wildlife. She was back to TR in creating that. And she was from Springdale, Pennsylvania, small town on the Allegheny River. The river was deeply polluted from glue and factories there. But she nevertheless found the enchantments in the woods and in the marshlands or wetlands, and would start studying birds. Many early and avid conservationists are birders, as you all know. And she had meaning have an eye for exactness. I've always agreed with Theodore Roosevelt, who even told people in the army you should be bird watchers, because it trains you to listen and look and hear, and you have keen perceptions. And it's the last thing you would think, but there's some great truth to that. But Carson was lucky. She had a mother that loved Henry David Thoreau and naturalists, John Burroughs and others. And Rachel Carson's mom encouraged her daughter to become a naturalist, or do natural history as it was called. But Rachel Carson went to a school called Chapman University, but back then it was Chapman's Women's School. It's right outside of Pittsburgh, all girls when she went there. And she met a Professor Skinner who recognized her innate literary skills. Rachel Carson writes like an angel. She's written the best writings we've ever had on oceans. And she had a Darwinian science mind. Very rare when you get somebody really good at a laboratory, very good at the science. Tweed will know that, Theodore Roosevelt's father, used to warn him about being a scientist per se, because of that he's too restless for that kind of laboratory work that you have to do if you're going to go in the science world. He, in TR, like Rachel Carson, wanted to write and travel and see the natural world. And she ended up with this professor getting a fellowship to Woods Hole. Do any of you know Woods Hole, Massachusetts? Mm-hmm. It was like Harvard and Carnegie Hall combined in the day, if you cared about oceans. You weren't, there weren't many people majoring in oceanography. I mean, these are like modern fields, but people have always studied the sea. And at Woods Hole, Massachusetts, on Cape Cod, the maps and nautical collection there was just first rate. And you would also get to see trawlers come into Woods Hole, and you'd get to they were finding new sea urchins and documenting them all the time. It was exciting. And she got deeply interested in eels. The migratory pattern of eels, and in fact, she couldn't believe that an eel from Africa could make a journey and end up in a river in Pennsylvania. I mean, and the amount of scientific work on eels was modest at best. It wasn't up to modern standards. We had done so much more with migratory birds than with a creature like the eel. But she then went and did an advanced degree in zoology at Johns Hopkins. She started writing about fish stocks, started writing about shad, cod. She went for U.S. Fish and Wildlife and wrote radio scripts during World War II about the natural world, and also about how we can use foodstuffs from the ocean if you're on a tight budget, and where the good places to fish are, and this sort of thing. But she also took on a series, much in the spirit of FDR, called Conservation in Action. And it was booklets. She wrote many and commissioned the others, really little brilliantly written booklets about wildlife refuges, where you do all the micro, down to how many muskrats are there, just really, but well-written ones. And everybody started noticing how, boy, she could turn copy around. You know who it reminds me of that period of her life is Peggy Noonan, who used to write speeches for CBS, and everybody at CBS couldn't believe Or Dick Goodwin, Doris Kearns Goodwin's husband, a speechwriter for Kennedy, and Johnson, they could write them quickly. Like, here's a beautiful speech. Carson could do that, and people started noticing. And she published an essay in the Atlantic. It led to her first book. And from 1941 until late 50s, there are 3 great books. If you haven't read them, you can get them conveniently. Library of America in 1 volume now. They are the best ocean writing our country's produced. I don't say that with the, and I underline the best.